This is the second session of the parable of the olive trees that the Apostle Paul presents in Romans chapter 11. The first session I gave a background and showed from the prophets that God had promised Israel to be saved several times, and even salvation everlasting, forever. And on the basis of these passages, the Apostle Paul makes his statement in Romans chapter 11, verses 25 and 26. But we'll get to them soon, probably in the third session of this set on this parable. But I'm repeating the beginning of the parable, starting from Romans 11, verse 13. Paul is first of all addressing the Gentiles. And he is addressing the Gentiles by presenting two olive trees, a wild olive tree and a cultivated olive tree. And he says that the concept is that holiness comes from the root, from the lump. And if the root is holy, the branches are holy. If the branches are not connected to the root that is holy, they cannot be holy in themselves. They come from the forest, from the wild. And therefore, he warns the Gentiles in this parable not to boast over the branches that were cut off or burned off, and to take a humble position, because the role of the Gentiles, according to Paul in the first part of this parable in Romans 11, is to provoke Israel to jealousy, which he already stated earlier in chapter 11, when he asked the key question that opens chapter 11, has God rejected his people whom he foreknew? Meaning the people of Israel. And he says, no, I am an Israelite. In the present tense, God has not rejected. And I brought earlier the passages from the prophets in which God states very clearly that he's not going to ever reject Israel as long as there is sun in the daytime, moon and stars at night. That's from Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 35 through 37. And in verse 37 in that same chapter, he states clearly that he's going to save Israel. The same thing is true in Ezekiel chapter 37, where he talks about the dry bones and the vision of the dry bones. And toward the end of the chapter, he states clearly that he's going to save Israel. And they will know that he's God, and he will know that they're his people, and they will be his people. And there is no doubt of Israel's salvation even without Paul's statement in chapter 11, verse 25 and 26. So, back to the parable. Normally speaking, if you ask any agronome, any man that deals with trees and with grafting onto trees, will tell you that you usually graft the good olive branches on the wild tree, because the wild tree usually has a much more stable root. And the branches have their DNA, their gene, and they bring the fruit, and they suck from the wild olive tree that is stronger normally. But in this case, there is a reversal of the natural process. And I've been hearing this, and this has been pointed out to me by very, very good scientists that deal with trees, that what Paul is proposing here is not the natural process, the healthy agricultural process. It is something that is in a divine economy. And in the divine economy, God has nurtured Israel for a specific purpose. He has chosen Abraham and his seed forever for a specific purpose. And the purpose is to be light to the nations, light to the Gentiles. This concept appears several times, but the clearest times are in Isaiah chapter 42, verse 6, and in Isaiah 49, verse 6. In both places we see that God tells Israel that their role in history is to be a light to the Gentiles, to bring the Gentiles who are worshiping idols and who have gone astray from God, to bring them back to God, to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to the God of Israel, to restore the relationship of the world to God as it was before the formation of nations in the Tower of Babel. And here he says that, yes, some branches have fallen off, have been cut off, have burned off from Israel, but the tree is still alive. And other branches were taken from the wild olive tree and grafted in to the natural olive tree. And they sucking their life, their nourishment, their holiness from the root. The root is where life is given to the branches and not vice versa. And Paul states that very clearly in Romans 11 in verse 16. If the first fruits be holy, the lump also is holy. And if the root be holy, so are the branches. All the branches that are naturally connected to the root, not grafted in, and also the branches that come from the wild olive tree that are connected to the root, grafted into the root, they receive their holiness from the root and not vice versa. This Paul develops in the continuation of the parable, and I want to read from verse 17. And some of the branches be broken off, and you being a wild olive tree, were grafted in among them, and with them partake of the root and the fatness of the olive tree. You, like in all of Paul's letters, usually means the Gentiles who have been added, who have been grafted in to the commonwealth of Israel, in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 11 and 12. So you, from the wild olive tree, were grafted in among the branches of the natural olive tree, and you are sucking your life, your fatness, from the root of that olive tree. Verse 18, boast not against the branches, but if you boast, you bearest not the root, but the root bears you. This is something that historically needs to be stressed very clearly. We're going to continue this parable in the third session, but historically, the church has done exactly what Paul says not to do. They have not only boasted against the Jewish people that were sent to exile, lost their homeland, lost Jerusalem for 2,000 years. They have burnt the Jews, killed the Jews, persecuted the Jews, not only during the Nazi Holocaust in the 20th century, but all through the centuries. For more than 1,500 years, Christianity has persecuted the Jews and marginalized the Jews. And Paul is writing this very parable for the purpose that this should not happen. Don't boast against the branches that have been fallen off. That's what Paul is saying here. And yet, how come Christian history is so bloody with Jewish blood? Not only Jewish blood, but specifically with Jewish blood, the blood of Israel. When Paul is writing this parable to prevent this and says to the Gentiles that have been grafted into the root, don't boast. We are going to continue this teaching in the third session and learn about the rest of this parable and its meaning and the origins of where Paul is building this parable from the prophets and from the Old Testament. Join us in the third session.